In 1998, the Hopi sent the eldest elder of the Hopi Nation to the United Nations to deliver the message that this map has left for the people of the earth.
There is a place in northern Arizona where the earth drops more than a mile straight down. A place so vast, so deep, and so geologically complex that after more than a century of modern exploration, scientists still haven't mapped all of it. Most people know the Grand Canyon as one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. A tourist destination, a geological textbook, a place you photograph from the rim, post to social media, and leave by sundown. But here's what they don't tell you at the visitor center. The canyon has a floor no tourist ever reaches. It has cave systems carved through ancient limestone that stretch for miles in directions no modern explorer has ever followed to their end. And deep inside those walls, in places reachable only by river and only by those willing to scale nearly vertical cliffs, there are chambers that remain, to this day, completely unexamined by mainstream science. Now here's where it gets interesting. In 2024 and 2025, researchers began feeding a very specific combination of data into Grok AI, the artificial intelligence system developed by xAI. The data included the full text of Hopi oral traditions as recorded by anthropologists across more than a century, the complete transcripts of a mysterious 1909 newspaper expedition report, the known geological survey data of the Grand Canyon's cave systems, and linguistic cross-reference analysis of indigenous terminologies connected to underground spaces in the American Southwest. The AI's task was straightforward: find the overlapping patterns. Identify what the Hopi oral record, the suppressed 1909 expedition, and the known archaeological data all point toward independently. The convergence Grok identified was not what anyone expected, and by the end of this video, you'll understand why the Hopi people, a nation that has lived beside the Grand Canyon for thousands of years, may have been quietly telling us the most accurate historical account of this landscape that has ever existed. While the rest of the world was busy dismissing it as mythology, stay with me, because this goes a lot deeper than the canyon itself.
The ancient Hopi on the mesas of northern Arizona in the United States have one of the most continuous records of their lineage and of their history from their creation story forward.
The world beneath the world. Hopi oral tradition. Before we get to Grok AI, before we get to 1909, before we examine the caves or the mummies or the artifacts, we need to start where the truth always starts, with the people who were there first. The Hopi are one of the oldest continuously inhabited cultures in North America. Their villages on the mesas of northern Arizona have been occupied for over 1,000 years, but their cultural memory, the knowledge carried in their oral traditions and clan histories, reaches back far beyond that. And for as long as those traditions have existed, they have described something that modern science is only beginning to take seriously: a world beneath the earth, not a metaphorical underworld, not a symbolic afterlife, not the kind of spiritual underground you might find in Greek or Norse mythology, reserved for the dead. The Hopi describe a real underground landscape, physical, structural, accessible, one that their ancestors lived inside before the present world began. According to the Hopi emergence tradition, one of the foundational accounts preserved through the Bear Clan, humanity has passed through multiple worlds. Each world ended through catastrophe. Each time, the survivors were guided to safety and eventually emerged into the next age. The current world we inhabit is not the first. It is the most recent. The transition point between the underground world and the present one is called the Sipapu. The Hopi describe it as a sacred opening in the earth, a literal threshold through which the ancestors climbed from below. Now stop here. Ask yourself this: how many cultures around the world describe an emergence from underground as a central historical event, not as poetry, not as metaphor, but as a remembered geographic fact? The Hopi don't just say, "We came from the earth." They describe the architecture of what existed underground. They describe the beings who already lived there. They describe the passages, the chambers, the geography. That level of structural detail is not the fingerprint of metaphor. It is the fingerprint of memory. And what they remember most clearly, what appears across the most versions of these traditions, is the beings who sheltered them underground. The Hopi call them the Ant People. Before your mind jumps to science fiction, stop. Because the Hopi descriptions are nothing like what that name suggests to a modern ear. The Ant People were not insect-like. They were not small or mindless or instinct-driven. According to Hopi elders whose accounts were recorded by anthropologists throughout the 20th century, the Ant People were intelligent. They lived in organized underground communities. They possessed knowledge of the subterranean world that the Hopi ancestors did not have. They were, in the words preserved in the oral record, tall, taller than ordinary people, and they were covered in hair. Let that sit with you for a moment. Tall, covered in hair, living in organized underground chambers beneath what is now the Grand Canyon. These descriptions were not generated by a novelist. They were not invented to sell a sensational newspaper story. They were passed down carefully within a closed clan tradition, from elders to students, in a culture where accuracy of transmission was considered a sacred responsibility. The Hopi Bear Clan elders have held this knowledge for generations, and they held it entirely separately from the outside world, from government surveys, from academic anthropology, from newspapers. That independence is crucial to understanding what happened next.
How they were able to share with us what it would mean for future generations, what to look for, the actual markings in time and history, so that we would know where we are in the cycles.
The 1909 expedition, a story that shouldn't exist. It is April 5th, 1909. You are a reader in Phoenix, Arizona. You pick up your copy of the Arizona Gazette, a legitimate, widely circulated newspaper. You turn to a prominent feature article, and you read something that makes you put your coffee down. An explorer named G.E. Kincaid, working on a government-sponsored expedition connected to the Smithsonian Institution, has discovered a hidden cave carved into the walls of the Grand Canyon. The entrance is accessible only by river. It sits hundreds of feet above the waterline on a nearly vertical cliff face. And inside is something that defies every model of pre-Columbian American history that has ever been proposed. The newspaper describes a massive underground complex, a central passage stretching more than 1,000 feet, dozens of chambers branching off in every direction. Some rooms contain grain, preserved so well it is still identifiable. Other chambers hold pottery, copper tools, carved weapons, and objects whose artistic style the expedition's archaeologists cannot classify within any known tradition of the American Southwest. And then the article says something truly extraordinary. Mummies. Several mummies. Seated, not laid flat, as Egyptian burial practice would suggest, but upright and seated, carefully wrapped and preserved inside the chambers. Nearby are statues and carved figures that the expedition's own archaeologists say resemble artistic traditions more commonly associated with Egypt or Asia than with any culture documented in North America. The walls are covered with inscriptions, symbols, a written language or symbolic system that no one on the expedition or in the academic community it consulted can identify. Just 4 days later, on April 9th, the Arizona Gazette runs a second article, not a retraction, not a correction, a follow-up, with additional details, additional chamber layouts, an expanded account of the artifacts, measurements. You don't run a detailed follow-up to a story you know is fake. And then, nothing. No photographs released to the public. No artifacts displayed in any museum. No scientific paper submitted to any academic journal. No official acknowledgement from the Smithsonian. The explorer, G.E. Kincaid, vanishes from the public record. The archaeologist referenced in the article, Professor S.A. Jordan, cannot be confirmed in Smithsonian employment records. Let me ask you something directly. If your institution had just been associated with the greatest archaeological discovery in American history, Chambers beneath the Grand Canyon containing mummies, unknown writing systems, and artifacts linking pre-Columbian America to ancient Egypt or Asia. Would you stay silent? Would you publish nothing? Would you permit your institution's name to be attached to a detailed newspaper story and then simply refuse to comment for over a century? What kind of institution does that? The Smithsonian, when researchers have pressed them on this over the decades, has given a consistent answer. No record of Kincaid, no record of Jordan, no record of the expedition. Some researchers accept that answer and close the file. The story was a hoax, a sensational piece of yellow journalism dressed up in official-sounding language. But others, historians, archivists, independent investigators, have pointed to something the dismissive reading conveniently ignores. The Antiquities Act of 1906, passed just 3 years before the expedition, gave the federal government explicit authority over significant archaeological discoveries made on federal land. The Grand Canyon was already under federal protection in 1909. Any discovery of the kind described in the Arizona Gazette would not have been subject to public disclosure. It would have been subject to federal management, federal classification. That doesn't prove the discovery happened, but it does explain, with clean historical logic, why an institution connected to such a discovery might have had every legal and political reason to say exactly nothing. The silence, in other words, is not necessarily evidence of fabrication. It may be evidence of something far more deliberate.
And what it would take for us in our thinking and the way we live to get through these cycles. I'm talking about the Hopi map of time.
What Grok AI found when it cross-referenced everything. This is where the story moves from historical mystery into something more unsettling. When researchers began using Grok AI to cross-analyze the Hopi oral tradition records, the 1909 Arizona Gazette articles, the known geological surveys of the Grand Canyon's cave systems, and the broader archaeological record of the American Southwest, the AI was not asked to confirm or deny the existence of the cave. It was asked to do something more precise: find the structural overlaps, identify which elements of the 1909 newspaper account, details, descriptors, architectural features, geographic characteristics, appear independently in the Hopi oral record. The results were significant. First, underground chamber architecture. The 1909 article describes a central passage with branching chambers. Hopi oral traditions repeatedly describe the underground world of the ant people as organized into chambers, connected by passages. Not a single large open space, a network, a structured interior geography. Both sources describe the same architectural logic independently. Second, the preservation of materials underground. The 1909 article describes grain found in underground chambers, preserved beyond normal expectation. Hopi traditions describe the ant people as providers of sustenance during catastrophe, beings who maintained stored food and resources inside their underground chambers for the Hopi ancestors during the periods they sheltered there. Third, the beings themselves. The 1909 account describes mummies in unusual postures and carved figures that appear stylistically unlike any known Native American artistic tradition. The Hopi oral record describes beings that are physically distinct from ordinary humans, larger, covered in hair, and possessing knowledge that predates the Hopi's own emergence. Two sources, zero communication between them. Same essential description of a non-ordinary population living or preserved underground in the same canyon. Fourth, and this is the one that stopped researchers cold, the location specificity. The 1909 article describes a cave entrance accessible only from the Colorado River and positioned hundreds of feet up an almost vertical cliff wall. Hopi traditions consistently place the entrance to the underground world, the Sipapu, near water, often associated with the river that runs through the canyon floor. The geographic alignment between the two accounts, when mapped against the known topography of the Grand Canyon, points to the same general section of the canyon. Grok's pattern analysis did not conclude that the 1909 expedition definitely happened. It is not capable of making that determination and was not designed to. What it found was something more precise and in many ways more troubling. The probability that two completely independent sources, one a 1909 newspaper account of a contemporary expedition, one a multi-generational oral tradition preserved inside a closed clan system, would independently converge on the same architectural descriptions, the same geographic location, the same physical characteristics of unusual beings, and the same preservation of materials underground, without either source having access to the other, is extraordinarily low. Statistically, convergence at that level of specificity typically indicates one of two things. Either both sources are drawing from a common fabrication, which would require the 1909 newspaper to have had detailed access to Hopi Bear Clan oral tradition that was not publicly available and had not been formally recorded by anthropologists at that point. Or both sources are independently describing something real. The AI doesn't choose between those options, but it maps the convergence clearly. And the convergence is difficult to explain away.
Well, this Hopi wisdom, it should come as no surprise. Intuitively, when we look at this, we say, well, of course, that makes total sense. Intuitively, it makes sense.
The geology of what's possible. At this point, you might be asking a reasonable question. Even if the Hopi oral traditions are accurate, and even if the 1909 expedition was real, is the physical geography of the Grand Canyon consistent with the existence of large underground chambers that remain unexplored? The answer is yes. Unambiguously yes. The Grand Canyon is not simply a valley carved by a river. It is a geological layer cake, billions of years of compressed earth, each stratum with different composition, different porosity, different structural properties. And within one of those strata, the Redwall Limestone Formation, a layer of ancient marine rock approximately 500 feet thick, lies one of the most extensive cave-forming geological environments in North America. Limestone dissolves under the chemical action of water over geological time. That dissolution process creates caves, passages, chambers, underground spaces that can extend for miles without ever being visible from the surface. The Redwall limestone in the Grand Canyon contains hundreds of known caves. Many have been partially explored. Some have yielded significant archaeological finds, ancient animal bones, split twig figurines, evidence of human occupation stretching back thousands of years. But here is the critical point. The word known is doing a lot of work in that sentence. The Grand Canyon's cave systems have never been comprehensively mapped. The sheer inaccessibility of much of the canyon wall, particularly in the stretches accessible only by river, means that a significant portion of its cave openings have never been entered by any modern researcher. The section of the canyon described in the 1909 Arizona Gazette article lies within precisely this kind of zone: vertical cliff faces, river access only. The kind of terrain where a cave entrance could sit for centuries without being noticed by anyone not specifically looking for it from a boat at exactly the right water level. In 2019, a team of canyon researchers using LiDAR, a laser-based remote sensing technology, identified numerous previously undocumented cave openings in sections of the canyon that had been considered thoroughly mapped. Several of those openings were in the Redwall Limestone Zone. None of them have been fully explored. The Hopi Cultural Preservation Office, in a formal statement issued in the year 2000, addressed the question of sacred sites within the Grand Canyon. The statement did not confirm or deny the 1909 expedition. It asked for something more fundamental: respect. It noted that certain locations within the canyon carry deep spiritual significance for the Hopi people and are not appropriate for outside investigation. That statement is not a confirmation, but it is not a denial either. It is the response of a people who know something that they do not feel obligated to share with a world that spent over a century dismissing their oral traditions as mythology.
So this Hopi map of time has been preserved for a very long time, and they said they preserved it for us, for you and me, so that we can benefit from their wisdom and do it today when we need it the most.
Why this matters and what we're still missing. Let's be precise about what we know and what we don't. We know the Arizona Gazette was a real newspaper. We know the April 5th and April 9th, 1909 articles genuinely exist and were published. We know the Smithsonian has officially denied any record of the expedition or the personnel named. We know the Hopi oral tradition describing underground chambers, unusual beings, and a sacred emergence site beneath the canyon predates the 1909 article by generations, potentially by centuries. We know the Grand Canyon contains extensive, incompletely explored cave systems in the exact geological formation most likely to produce large underground chambers. We know that LiDAR surveys continue to identify previously unknown features in sections of the canyon that were thought to be well documented. And we know that when Grok AI was asked to cross-reference these independent sources without access to each other, it identified a pattern of convergence at a level of structural specificity that is statistically difficult to attribute to coincidence. What we don't know is whether the chamber described in 1909 exists, whether the mummies and artifacts are real, whether G.E. Kincaid was a real explorer, a fabricated name, or something more complex, a real person whose records were quietly removed, whether the Smithsonian's silence reflects ignorance or policy. And that asymmetry, knowing enough to know the question is real, but not enough to answer it, is exactly what has kept this story alive for over a century. Here's a question I want you to sit with for a moment. Think about the civilizations we consider discovered versus the civilizations we consider lost. Machu Picchu existed for centuries before Western explorers documented it, while the local population maintained an unbroken memory of exactly where it was and what it meant. Göbekli Tepe was buried for 12,000 years while the region's people preserved fragmented oral traditions that pointed archaeologists toward the hill when they finally started digging. The pattern is consistent. The people who live closest to a place remember it most accurately. Academic and institutional history, written history, catches up eventually. But it catches up to what the oral traditions already knew. The Hopi have been telling the world about an underground world beneath the Grand Canyon for as long as anyone has been willing to listen. The question is not whether they are right. The question is what we would find if we actually looked. The suppression question. No serious examination of the 1909 Grand Canyon story can avoid the most uncomfortable possibility directly. If the expedition happened, if Kincaid entered those chambers, if the Smithsonian's archaeologists documented the mummies and the artifacts and the inscriptions, why would the story be buried? The convenient answer is that it was never buried because it never happened. Hoax. Done. But let's examine what a genuine suppression would have required in 1909 and what motivation might have driven it. The artifacts described in the Arizona Gazette, the carved figures with stylistic similarities to Egyptian or Asian, artistic traditions, the unidentified written inscriptions, the mummies in unusual burial postures would, if authentic, represent evidence of a pre-Columbian connection between the civilizations of the American Southwest and cultures of the ancient Near East or Asia. In 1909, that was not just archaeologically inconvenient, it was culturally catastrophic for the prevailing academic model of American prehistory, which held that the indigenous peoples of the Americas had developed entirely in isolation from the civilizations of the Old World. Evidence of cultural contact, or worse, evidence of a shared civilization that predated the assumed isolation model, would have required a rewriting of the foundational narrative of American history. The Antiquities Act of 1906 didn't just give the federal government the right to manage archaeological sites on federal land. It gave the government the legal mechanism to control what information about those sites entered public discourse. Is it possible that a discovery of that magnitude, in that political and cultural climate, could have been quietly placed under federal management, never officially denied, but simply never confirmed? That the Arizona Gazette story got just far enough into print before the institutional machinery closed around it? The answer is yes. That is possible. It is not proven. But the historical and legal mechanism for exactly that kind of suppression existed and was operational in 1909. And one more thing, Researchers who have searched for records of G.E. Kincaid across historical archives have found fragmentary references, not confirmed employment with the Smithsonian, not a clear expedition record, but scattered references to a person by that name existing in the historical record of the period. That is not confirmation. But it is not the complete absence of a person that a complete fabrication would typically produce. A completely invented name would leave no trace. A real person whose official records were removed might leave exactly the kind of fragmentary, difficult to confirm evidence that researchers keep finding.
What Grok AI changes about this conversation. For most of the 20th century, the 1909 Grand Canyon story was evaluated the way most historical mysteries are, through the judgment calls of individual researchers, the institutional positions of academic bodies, and the cultural biases of whoever happened to be asking the question.
The Hopi oral tradition was treated as mythology. The Arizona Gazette articles were dismissed as yellow journalism. The Smithsonian's denial was taken as conclusive. The mystery was filed and forgotten, or kept alive only in fringe publications that tended to overstate the evidence in ways that made serious researchers reluctant to engage. AI changes that dynamic in a specific and important way. Grok doesn't have a professional reputation to protect. It doesn't have a career invested in the existing archaeological consensus. It doesn't feel the cultural discomfort of suggesting that an indigenous oral tradition might be more historically accurate than a century of institutional archaeology. It simply identifies patterns, it cross-references sources, it maps convergence, and when it was pointed at the full body of evidence connected to the Grand Canyon mystery, the Hopi oral records, the 1909 newspaper accounts, the geological survey data, the archaeological evidence from the canyon's known cave systems, it found a convergence that the human researchers who dismissed each piece of evidence in isolation had never been positioned to see. The Hopi emergence tradition describes underground chambers. The 1909 expedition describes underground chambers. The Redwall limestone formation contains extensive, incompletely explored underground chambers. LiDAR surveys continue to identify new openings in those formations. These are not four separate mysteries, they are four data points pointing at the same location. Grok identified them as a cluster, a pattern, a convergence point that the academic community, for institutional, political, and cultural reasons, had never been willing to examine as a unified body of evidence. That doesn't mean the cave exists exactly as described in 1909. It doesn't mean the Hopi emergence tradition is a literal geological diary. It doesn't mean the Smithsonian buried the greatest archaeological discovery in American history, though it doesn't rule that out either. What it means is that the question deserves to be asked properly, with modern technology, with LiDAR surveys of the sections of canyon wall that match the geographic description in the 1909 article, with drone access to cliff faces that have never been examined up close, with the kind of systematic archaeological survey that the Grand Canyon's cave systems have simply never received. The Hopi have been patient for a very long time. Terror in the truth. Let me tell you why this story is actually terrifying. Not in the Hollywood monster sense. In a much quieter, much more real sense. The terrifying possibility is not that there are mummies in a cave beneath the Grand Canyon. It's not that the Smithsonian suppressed an expedition. It's not even that an AI just identified a pattern that a century of human researchers missed. The terrifying possibility is this: the oldest, most detailed, most accurate historical record of the Grand Canyon's underground geography was always available. It was spoken aloud. It was passed down through generations by people who regarded its preservation as sacred. It described the architecture of the underground world, the location of the entrance, the beings who lived inside, and the way those beings preserved knowledge and life through catastrophe. And for over 100 years, the academic community, the institutions that are supposed to find these things, classified that record as mythology and moved on. What else have we dismissed? How many other oral traditions, from how many other indigenous cultures around the world, describe real places, real events, real beings that we have filed under mythology because they don't fit the model we built without consulting the people who were there. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, the idea that a comet strike approximately 12,000 years ago caused a sudden and catastrophic global climate event, was treated as fringe science for decades. Then researchers started matching it against flood myths from cultures around the world. The convergence was remarkable. Cultures with no contact with each other, separated by oceans, had independently preserved the memory of the same catastrophic event. The Grand Canyon story follows the same structural logic. One culture preserves the memory of an underground world. One newspaper account describes the discovery of that underground world. 1. Geological formation makes it physically plausible. One AI identifies the convergence, and one question has never been properly answered. What is actually down there? The question the canyon keeps. The Grand Canyon is over 200 miles long. It reaches nearly 6,000 feet deep at its lowest points. It contains more geological history in its exposed rock layers than almost any other single location on the surface of the Earth. And every year, millions of people stand at its rim, look into the void, and think they understand what they're looking at. They don't. They see the part the Park Service maintains. The trails, the overlooks, the visitor centers, the carefully curated version of one of the most complex landscapes on Earth. The canyon keeps its deepest places to itself. The Hopi have always known that. Their traditions don't describe the Grand Canyon as a tourist destination or a geological exhibit. They describe it as a threshold, a place where the boundary between the underground world and the surface world is thinner than anywhere else on the continent. A place where their ancestors crossed that boundary and where something that was already there helped them survive. Whether Grok AI's pattern analysis, the 1909 Arizona Gazette report, and the Hopi oral tradition all point to the same physical reality beneath the canyon's cliff walls, that is a question that only a comprehensive, properly resourced, technologically advanced archaeological survey will ever answer. That survey has never been conducted. It should be. But here is what I want to leave you with today. Before the technology, before the AI analysis, before the debates about suppression and authenticity and yellow journalism, there is a people who have lived beside this canyon for thousands of years, who have preserved their history with a precision and a dedication that puts most institutional archives to shame, who have been telling anyone willing to listen that the canyon is not simply what it appears to be on the surface. They have not been asking us to believe them, they have simply been remembering. And maybe the most important thing Grok AI revealed, when it cut through the institutional noise and the academic bias and the century of dismissal, is that the people who were always right about what lies beneath the Grand Canyon never needed an AI to tell them so. They already knew. Now the question is whether the rest of us are willing to take that knowledge seriously before whatever lies beneath those limestone walls is lost forever. To time, to rising river levels, to the slow collapse of formations that have held their secrets for longer than human civilization has existed. The Grand Canyon is still there. The caves are still unexplored. The Hopi traditions are still preserved. And the truth, whatever it is still waiting. Before you leave, I want to know what you think. Do you believe the Hopi oral traditions and the 1909 Arizona Gazette story are independently pointing at the same real underground place? Or is the convergence Grok identified a coincidence, two stories that happen to rhyme without sharing a source? Drop your answer in the comments. Because this is exactly the kind of question that gets more interesting the more people think about it. And if you want more investigations like this one, historical records, AI analysis, indigenous knowledge, and the archaeology they don't teach in school, subscribe. Every video goes deeper, and we are nowhere near done with the Grand Canyon. See you in the next one.